On a scorching Texas afternoon, a 10-year-old girl was about to experience the most terrifying moment of her life. What started as a simple day selling lemonade to help her sick mother turned into a lesson that no one on that street would ever forget. And when a biker decided to attack a defenseless child, he had no idea that Matt Damon was watching everything unfold. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special shout out for you in an upcoming story. It was one of those Texas summer afternoons that makes asphalt shimmer like water. In Beaumont, a small town where red brick houses stretch along wide, dusty streets, the thermometer read 100 degrees in the shade. American flags hanging from porches barely fluttered in the still air, and the only sound breaking the silence was the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime. Sophia Martinez, just 10 years old, had woken up that morning with a mission. Her mother, Maria, had been hospitalized in the town's medical center for 3 weeks, battling complications from diabetes that had worsened due to their inability to afford proper medication. The medical bills were piling up like autumn leaves, and Sophia's father, Carlos, was working double shifts at the construction site just to keep their small apartment. But Sophia wasn't the type of girl to sit around feeling sorry for herself. She had inherited her mother's fierce determination and her father's work ethic. That morning, she had dragged an old wooden cart from their garage, painted a crooked sign that read "Fresh Lemonade $1, 0 cents," and set up shop on the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue. The cart was simple but sturdy, made from weathered wood that Carlos had used for a previous project. Sophia had covered it with a checkered tablecloth that had seen better days, and arranged plastic cups in neat rows. A large glass pitcher, sweating with condensation, held her grandmother's secret lemonade recipe, the perfect balance of tart and sweet that had won over neighbors for generations. As the afternoon wore on, Sophia's optimism began to waver. A few kind neighbors had stopped to buy cups of lemonade, offering encouraging smiles and extra quarters. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had bought 3 cups and told Sophia she was braver than most adults. A young mother with twin toddlers had purchased lemonade for her entire family and let the children keep the change. But business was slow. The heat was relentless, and most people hurried past with their heads down, focused on getting to their air-conditioned destination. Sophia wiped the sweat from her forehead with a faded pink towel and counted the crumpled bills and scattered coins in her small metal box. $12.37. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was a start. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. Sophia had been standing behind her cart for nearly 4 hours, her small legs aching and her voice hoarse from calling out to potential customers. The lemonade in her pitcher had grown warm despite her best efforts to keep it cool with ice from their kitchen freezer. She thought about her mother, lying in that sterile hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed throughout the night. Maria had always been the strongest person Sophia knew, the woman who worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat, who never complained even when the bills seemed impossible to pay, who always found a way to make their small apartment feel like home. Now, it was Sophia's turn to be strong. A pickup truck rumbled past, kicking up dust that settled on Sophia's carefully arranged cups. She quickly covered them with a clean dish towel and waited for the cloud to pass. In the distance, she could hear the familiar sounds of suburban Texas life. Lawn mowers running, children playing in backyards, the occasional bark of a dog, and the steady hum of cicadas that seemed to grow louder as the day grew hotter. An elderly man in overalls and a John Deere cap approached the stand. His weathered face spoke of decades working under the Texas sun, and his kind eyes reminded Sophia of her grandfather back in Mexico. "How much for a cup, little lady?" he asked, his voice carrying the slow drawl of a lifelong Texan. "Just $1, sir," Sophia replied, immediately reaching for her cleanest cup. The man watched as she carefully poured the lemonade, making sure not to spill a drop. "This for a school project or something?" Sophia's cheeks flushed slightly. "No, sir. My mom's in the hospital, and I'm trying to help with the bills." The man's expression softened. He pulled out his wallet and placed a $5 bill in Sophia's collection box. Keep the change, sweetheart. Your mama raised a good girl." As he walked away, sipping the lemonade and nodding appreciatively, Sophia felt a surge of hope. Maybe she could make a difference after all. The peaceful afternoon atmosphere shattered like glass when the roar of a motorcycle engine cut through the suburban quiet. The sound grew louder and more aggressive as it approached, drowning out the gentle hum of the neighborhood. Sophia looked up from reorganizing her cups to see a massive Harley-Davidson coming down Maple Street, its chrome gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The bike came to an abrupt stop directly in front of Sophia's lemonade stand, its engine revving unnecessarily loud before finally falling silent. The rider was everything Sophia's father had taught her to be wary of, a man who seemed to wear his aggression like armor. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms covered in dark tattoos that told stories Sophia was too young to understand. His leather vest bore patches that spoke of motorcycle clubs and philosophies that had no place on a quiet residential street. But it was his eyes that frightened Sophia the most. They held a coldness that seemed to consume the warmth of the Texas afternoon, a meanness that suggested he found pleasure in other people's discomfort. "Well, well, well," the man said, his voice carrying a tone that immediately put Sophia on edge. "What do we have here?" Sophia's mouth went dry, but she managed to speak. "Would you like some lemonade, sir? It's only $1. The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lemonade? Kid, do you have any idea whose territory this is?" Sophia didn't understand what he meant. This was just Maple Street, the same street where she'd ridden her bicycle 1,000 times, where Mrs. Patterson walked her golden retriever every evening, where the school bus picked her up every morning during the school year. "I don't understand, sir," she said quietly. "Of course you don't understand," the man sneered. "You're just a little girl playing games where you don't belong." The few people who had been walking along the street began to slow down, sensing the tension that was building like storm clouds on a clear day. A mother with a stroller crossed to the other side of the street. An elderly couple who had been walking their dogs stopped and pretended to examine something in a shop window, but Sophia could see them watching nervously. "Sir? I'm just trying to help my mom," Sophia said, her voice trying to help my mom. "Your mom?" The man's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "Your mom should have taught you not to set up shop where you're not wanted." But what happened next unfolded so quickly that the witnesses would later struggle to give coherent statements to the police. The biker, whose name was Jake Morrison, and who had been drinking at a bar 3 blocks away, decided that this little girl's lemonade stand was somehow an affront to his authority on the street. Without warning, he stepped forward and kicked the wooden cart with such force that it flew backward, landing on its side with a crash that echoed off the nearby houses. The glass pitcher shattered against the sidewalk, sending lemonade and shards of glass in every direction. The carefully arranged plastic cups scattered like leaves in a tornado, and the small metal box containing Sophia's hard-earned money flew open, spilling coins across the concrete. Sophia instinctively jumped backward, but not before the sticky lemonade splashed across her legs and the hem of her yellow sundress, the same dress her mother had bought her for Easter just 3 months earlier. The shock of what had just happened left her speechless, her dark eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "There," Jake Morrison snarled, clearly pleased with his destruction. "Maybe now you'll think twice before setting up your little business, where it doesn't belong." The people who had been watching from a distance were frozen in shock. A man in a business suit had his phone out, clearly torn between calling the police and simply recording what was happening. 2 teenage girls who had been walking home from the community pool were staring in open-mouthed horror. An elderly woman in a flower print dress was clutching her purse to her chest, looking around desperately for someone, anyone, to intervene. But no one moved. The size and obvious aggression of the biker had created an invisible barrier that seemed impossible to cross. Sophia, still in shock, knelt down and began trying to pick up the scattered coins, her small hands shaking as she reached for quarters and dimes that were now mixed with broken glass and spilled lemonade. A few tears had begun to escape despite her best efforts to be brave, and they fell silently onto the concrete below. "Look at me when I'm talking to you!" Morrison barked, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a whip. Sophia looked up, her face streaked with tears and dust. and Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction at having established his dominance over this small corner of the world. That's when he made his biggest mistake. He never looked behind him. Matt Damon had been having one of those perfect Texas afternoons that reminded him why he had fallen in love with this part of the country. He was in Beaumont researching a role for an upcoming film about small-town America, and he had spent the morning talking to locals at the coffee shop on Main Street, listening to their stories and getting a feel for the rhythms of their daily lives. He had always been drawn to authentic stories, the kind that revealed the dignity and complexity of ordinary people living extraordinary lives in their own quiet ways. Beaumont, with its mix of working-class families, retirees, and young professionals, seemed like the perfect place to find those stories. Matt was dressed to blend in. Worn jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, scuffed brown boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another local resident out for an afternoon walk. This anonymity was precious to him, allowing him to observe and interact without the complications that fame inevitably brought. He had been walking down Maple Street, enjoying the shade of the old oak trees that lined the sidewalk, when he heard the sound of the motorcycle engine growing louder and more aggressive. Something about the way the bike was being driven, the unnecessary revving, the aggressive acceleration and braking, put him on alert. Matt had grown up in Massachusetts, but he had spent enough time in different parts of America to recognize the sound of trouble brewing. As he approached the corner of Maple and 3rd Avenue, he could see a small crowd of people who seemed to be watching something with a mixture of fascination and concern. Then he saw the lemonade stand, and the little girl behind it, and the large man on the motorcycle who was clearly agitated about something. Matt's pace slowed as his instincts kicked in. He had 3 daughters of his own, and something about the body language of the scene ahead made his protective instincts surge to the surface. The biker was leaning forward aggressively, his voice raised, while the little girl seemed to be shrinking back behind her cart. When Jake Morrison kicked the cart and sent it flying, Matt felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. When he saw the little girl drop to her knees to pick up coins from the broken glass and spilled lemonade, that coldness transformed into something much more dangerous. Matt Damon had played many roles in his career: soldiers, spies, astronauts, and mathematicians. But in that moment, he wasn't an actor. He was simply a father who couldn't stand by and watch a child be terrorized by a grown man who should have known better. Matt's approach was deliberate and calm, the kind of measured movement that spoke of confidence rather than aggression. He had learned long ago that the most effective way to diffuse a dangerous situation was to project calm strength rather than matching aggression with aggression. As he walked toward the scene, Matt's mind was racing through possibilities. The biker was clearly larger and younger than him, and possibly intoxicated based on his erratic behavior. There were witnesses present, which was both good and bad. Good because it meant there would be accountability. Bad because it meant any confrontation would likely be recorded and shared across social media within minutes. But none of that mattered as much as the little girl who was now trying to salvage her lemonade business while fighting back tears. "Hey there," Matt said softly as he approached Sophia, deliberately ignoring the biker for the moment. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Sophia looked up, her dark eyes still wide with shock and fear. She nodded quickly, not trusting her voice, and continued trying to collect the scattered coins. Matt knelt down beside her, careful to avoid the broken glass, and began helping her gather the money. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophia," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Matt." He handed her a handful of quarters and dimes. "Were you hurt when this happened?" Sophia shook her head, but Matt could see a small cut on her knee where she had scraped against the concrete. "Hey!" Jake Morrison's voice boomed above them. "I wasn't done talking to the little girl." Matt stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he turned to face Morrison, there was something in his eyes that made the bigger man take an involuntary step backward. "Actually," Matt said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the afternoon air, "I think you were done." The crowd that had been watching from a distance began to move closer, sensing that the dynamics of the situation had shifted dramatically. Someone with a phone had started recording, and the video would later go viral, with the caption, "Matt Damon stands up to bully." But Matt wasn't thinking about cameras or viral videos. He was thinking about his daughter, Stella, who was just a few years older than Sophia, and how he would feel if someone had treated her the way this man had just treated this little girl. Jake Morrison had spent most of his adult life using his size and aggressive demeanor to intimidate people into giving him what he wanted. It was a strategy that had worked remarkably well in bars, parking lots, and various other situations where conflict arose. He had never met someone who refused to back down when faced with his particular brand of menace. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Morrison demanded, puffing out his chest and taking a step toward Matt. "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing kids get pushed around," Matt replied evenly. Morrison looked Matt up and down, taking in the simple clothes and the calm demeanor. This guy didn't look like much. Average height, not particularly muscular, probably some kind of office worker trying to play hero. "Well, this isn't your business, office boy," Morrison sneered, "so why don't you just keep walking before you get hurt?" Matt didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at Sophia, who was still kneeling on the ground, trying to salvage what remained of her lemonade stand. Her yellow sundress was stained with lemonade and dirt, and there were tears she was trying very hard not to shed. When Matt looked back at Morrison, something had changed in his expression. "Actually," Matt said, his voice carrying a tone that made several people in the crowd step closer to hear, "when someone decides to terrorize a little girl who's trying to help her sick mother, that becomes everyone's business." Morrison felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something about this guy's calm confidence that didn't add up. Most people either backed down immediately or came at him swinging. This guy was doing neither, and it was throwing Morrison off his game. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Morrison asked, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments earlier. "I think I'm someone who believes that grown men shouldn't pick on children," Matt replied, "and I think you know that too." The crowd had grown larger now, with people emerging from nearby houses and shops to see what was happening. Someone had called the police, and the distant sound of sirens could be heard approaching. Morrison looked around and realized that he was no longer dealing with a frightened little girl and a crowd of passive observers. He was facing a man who clearly had no intention of backing down, surrounded by people who were now actively watching and recording his every move. The approaching sirens seemed to crystallize something in Jake Morrison's mind. Whatever point he had been trying to make by intimidating a 10-year-old girl selling lemonade was rapidly becoming overshadowed by the reality of his situation. He was a grown man who had just destroyed a child's business in full view of multiple witnesses, at least some of whom were recording everything. "This is ridiculous," Morrison muttered, but the aggressive edge had gone out of his voice. Matt knelt back down beside Sophia and continued helping her collect the scattered coins and plastic cups that hadn't been broken. "Sophia," he said quietly, "what were you going to do with the money from your lemonade stand?" "My mom's in the hospital," Sophia said, her voice barely audible. "The bills are really high and my dad's working extra shifts, but it's still not enough." Matt nodded thoughtfully, then stood and pulled out his wallet. He counted out several $20 bills and placed them gently in Sophia's collection box. "That should help," he said simply. The gesture seemed to galvanize the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, who had bought lemonade earlier, hurried forward with a $10 bill. The man in the business suit who had been recording everything put away his phone and pulled out his wallet. The teenage girls who had been walking home from the pool pooled their allowance money together. Within minutes, Sophia's collection box contained more money than she had ever seen in her life. Morrison watched this display of community solidarity with growing discomfort. What had started as him asserting dominance over a small corner of his territory had somehow transformed into something that made him look like the villain in a story where everyone else was the hero. "Look," Morrison said, his voice lacking its earlier aggression, "maybe I got a little carried away." Matt stood up and turned to face him. "A little carried away?" he repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You terrorized a child who was trying to help her family. You destroyed her property and made her cry. That's not getting carried away. That's being a bully." The police cars were getting closer now, and Morrison could see the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of nearby houses. "What do you want from me?" Morrison asked, and for the first time he sounded more tired than aggressive. "I want you to apologize to Sophia," Matt said simply, "and I want you to help her set up her lemonade stand again, and then I want you to walk away and think about whether this is the kind of person you want to be." What happened next surprised everyone, including Morrison himself. As he looked down at Sophia, who was still kneeling on the ground, sorting through broken glass and scattered coins, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the approaching police sirens, or the crowd of neighbors who were now openly glaring at him, or the calm authority of the stranger who had refused to be intimidated. Or maybe it was simply the sight of a 10-year-old girl in a stained yellow dress, trying not to cry while she salvaged what remained of her attempt to help her hospitalized mother. "Kid," Morrison said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Sophia looked up at him, her dark eyes still wary, but no longer filled with terror. "I had no right to do what I did," Morrison continued, kneeling down to help gather the scattered cups. "Your lemonade stand. It's a good thing you're doing, helping your mom and all." Matt watched this exchange with careful attention, ready to intervene if Morrison's apparent change of heart proved to be temporary. But something in the biker's demeanor had genuinely shifted. The aggressive posturing was gone, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. "My mom used to make lemonade," Morrison said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Every summer, she'd set up a pitcher on the back porch, and the whole neighborhood would come by." The police cars had arrived now, their lights flashing as two officers approached the scene. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, uncertain how to explain what they had witnessed. Morrison stood up slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "Officers," he said as the policemen approached, "I need to report myself for destroying this little girl's property." Officer Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the Beaumont Police Department, looked around at the scene with confusion. He had been expecting to break up a fight or deal with a domestic disturbance, not to find a biker voluntarily confessing to vandalism. "Sir, can you explain what happened here?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Morrison took a deep breath. "I got angry about something stupid and I took it out on a kid who was just trying to help her family. I kicked over her lemonade stand and scared her. I'd like to pay for the damages and make this right." Matt watched as Morrison pulled out his wallet and counted out several bills, placing them in Sophia's collection box alongside the donations from the neighbors. "I can't undo what I did," Morrison said to Sophia, "but I hope this helps with your mom's hospital bills." By the time the police had finished taking statements and the crowd had begun to disperse, the sun was setting over Beaumont, painting the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Sophia's lemonade stand had been restored with help from half the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson had brought a new tablecloth, the teenage girls had contributed a fresh pitcher from their house, and several neighbors had promised to return the next day with friends and family to buy lemonade. Matt had stayed to make sure Sophia was truly okay, helping her pack up the remaining supplies and count the money in her collection box. The amount was staggering, nearly $300, more than Sophia had ever imagined possible. "Miss Matt," Sophia said as they loaded the cart into her father's pickup truck, which had arrived when someone called to tell him what had happened. "Why did you help me?" Matt smiled, thinking of his own daughters back home in Los Angeles. "Because everyone deserves to have someone stand up for them when they need it," he said simply. "And because what you're doing for your mom is really special." Sophia's father, Carlos, had thanked Matt with tears in his eyes, explaining that the money would cover nearly 2 months of Maria's medication costs. The community's response had been overwhelming. Several local businesses had already called to offer Sophia regular spots to sell lemonade, and the local newspaper wanted to do a story about her efforts. As for Jake Morrison, he had quietly left after giving his statement to the police and paying a fine for disturbing the peace, but not before approaching Matt one last time. "I don't know who you are," Morrison had said, "but thank you for stopping me before I did something really stupid." Matt had simply nodded, understanding that sometimes people just needed someone to remind them of who they could choose to be. As Matt walked back toward his hotel, he reflected on the unexpected turn his research day had taken. He had come to Beaumont looking for authentic stories about small-town America, and he had found one. not in a coffee shop interview or a planned meeting, but in a spontaneous moment of crisis that had revealed the best and worst of human nature. The story would indeed make its way around the internet, with cell phone footage showing Matt Damon defends girl's lemonade stand. But for Matt, the real story wasn't about a celebrity intervention. It was about a community that had come together to support a child in need, and about how one moment of courage could inspire others to act with kindness. 3 weeks later, Sophia's mother was released from the hospital, her condition stabilized by medication that was now affordable, thanks to the generosity of strangers who had become friends. Sophia continued to run her lemonade stand on weekends, but now it was as much about connecting with her neighbors as it was about raising money. And sometimes, on particularly hot Texas afternoons, Jake Morrison would stop by, not on his motorcycle but in his pickup truck, to buy a cup of lemonade and ask Sophia how her mother was doing. Because sometimes redemption comes in the simplest acts of human kindness. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the streets of Texas, where we witness how one moment of courage can change everything. Sophia's story reminds us that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they're famous actors, sometimes they're 10-year-old girls with lemonade stands, and sometimes they're people who find the strength to change after making a mistake. Remember, each one of us has the power to make a difference in someone's life. Whether it's standing up for someone who needs help, supporting a local business, or simply choosing kindness over indifference, we all have opportunities every day to be the hero of someone else's story. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that celebrate the best of human nature. Until next time, keep looking for ways to make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time.